Hi, I'm Howie Silberger, your political hitman, right here on Israel News Talk Radio. Moedim v'simcha, happy holidays, and I hope life is good. We are celebrating the holiday of Passover. Passover is the celebration of Jewish freedom. Now, it seems a little ironic that this week we would be celebrating freedom when we're all living in captivity. It seems a little ironic that we would be celebrating freedom when we're not really free people, are we? Now, I'm not only talking about COVID restrictions, which have held us into captivity for the last year or so. I'm talking in general. Are we really free? Do we really live a life of freedom? Religiously? Do we live a life of freedom personally? Do we live in an environment where we could be totally free? And if we don't live in that environment, if we don't live in freedom, then how can we sit every year at the Pesach Seder? How can we sit every year at Passover and thank God for our freedom and celebrate the freedom of the Jewish people? Now, I understand we're commemorating an event that happened thousands of years ago. I understand it was the event that led to the formation of the Jewish people and our religious identity. But I wonder, as I wonder with a lot of things, do we really live up to the standard that was set for us? Do we really live up to the standard that we should be living up to? I want to look at this and a whole lot more right here on Political Hitman on Israel News Talk Radio. You could call in. We're live. Go to the website, israelnewstalkradio.com. You could join me in the chat room there. I'm in the chat room the entire program. And I really want to get your opinion on this. We'll get deep into this. We'll walk through this, and we'll try to understand how we could be free while living in captivity. It seems a little odd. It seems a little strange to me, but it is true. We are doing it. We are living in freedom while we are living in captivity. So I want to take a look at this, and I want to explore this whole topic with you. It's something that I think is really interesting. I'm Howie Silberger. This is Political Hitman, right here on Israel News Talk Radio. We'll be back. Joey Silberger, your political hitman, right here on Israel News Talk Radio. Join me in the chat room on IsraelNewsTalkRadio.com, where the conversation is always great and your opinion really matters. You can also call in. Numbers to call in North America, 301-768-4841. In Israel, the number is 026500-151. Those numbers can always be found on the top of the page on IsraelNewsTalkRadio.com. So, we are celebrating the holiday of Passover. The holiday where we celebrate the freedom from bondage of the Hebrews, of the Jewish people, or the predecessors to the Jewish people. And we celebrate the fact that God led us out of Egypt. He led us out of slavery. He brought us through the desert, gave us the Torah, and then led us into the promised land. This is the holiday that started it all. The question is, though, while the Jews in Egypt were released from freedom, they were released from slavery. They got their freedom. Did we continue that path of freedom? Did we still live in freedom? I don't think so. I really don't believe that Jews today, or people today in general, live in freedom. Now, we can look in the last year, and we can look at the lockdowns and at the COVID restrictions and the mask regulations and the fact that the governments keep lying to us about what's going on with COVID, forcing us to do things which make absolutely zero sense. We can look at that and look at the fact that we follow all these regulations like little sheep. We follow the regulations. And we listen to Big Daddy Government as Big Daddy Government tells us what we have to do. We could do that. We could go down that route, and we could take a look at that. And we could see that our freedoms are really curtailed, aren't they? Now, I'm not saying we should live in an anarchy. I'm not saying we should live in a society with no rules, and I'm not saying that we should be living fully free, because we still have to live under the guise of God's rules. So I'm not saying that society shouldn't have limits to it. Of course, it should. If you leave man alone without limits, we end up with chaos, anarchy, and craziness. So we need limits. And man needs laws. Man, when I talk about man, generically, so don't attack me for using generic terms. It's all baloney anyway. So when we talk about mankind needing limits, mankind needs limits. If we don't have limits, we don't have rules. We cannot survive in this vast world. We'd end up going crazy and killing each other and factional warfare. We see it. You see it in undeveloped countries. You see it in developed countries sometimes. You're seeing it in the United States of America these days. Factional warfare where one side's really trying to destroy the other side. This is what happens when you don't have rules, or when rules are curtailed to fit whatever whims of society has today. So this is what happens. So I don't believe we actually live in freedom. If we lived in freedom, what would that look like? What would it look like to live in freedom? Think about it for a second. Stop and think for a second. What would it look like to live in freedom? The average person, I've asked this question to my classroom of grade 9 students. I asked the exact same question. And they stopped for a second. They thought about it. And they said they can't even imagine what it would mean to live in freedom. They couldn't even come up with concrete ideas on what freedom would be. Because when you're a kid, you're definitely not living in freedom. You have your parents' rules, you have your school's rules, there's rules and regulations and stuff you can do and stuff you can't do. The government regulates you, the parents regulate you, the school regulates you. There's no way you're living in freedom. And as you get older, the rules get tighter and tighter, don't they? When you turn 18, 19, 20, 21, depending where you live, and you're allowed to drive, and you're allowed to drink, and you're allowed to do all sorts of stuff that adults are allowed to do, gamble, drink, drive. Do you find that you're free at that point? Or do you find that you're more limited with these freedoms? I speak to many, many adults who tell me, wow, I wish I was a kid again. When I was a kid, I was carefree. I didn't have to worry about anything. As an adult, now I have to worry about taxes. I have to worry about car payments and house payments and going to work and and making a living and supporting my family. This is stuff I have to worry about, where I didn't have to worry about this stuff when I was a kid. So many people tell me, I wish I was a kid again. When I was a kid, I was free. Now I'm an adult. I'm stuck under this burden, under this bondage. I'm stuck as an adult. As a kid, I was able to get on my bike and drive for hours and not care about anything. I just have to worry about getting home before the lights go out. Now I have to worry about paying my bills. I have to worry about feeding my family. I have to worry about my children and raising my children and making sure my children are good people by imposing more rules on them. This is what I have to do. I have to ensure my children don't have the freedom that we were promised at Passover. Now, some of you might say, wait a second, Howie, what are you talking about? Passover doesn't say that you should have ultimate freedom. Passover isn't a holiday that says that you should be running around willy-nilly doing whatever you want. That's not the idea of Passover. Passover is the idea of freedom, physical freedom from bondage, so you're not a slave anymore. And Passover is the idea of religious freedom, of the freedom of religion, the freedom to practice your religion. Oh, really? So tell me, how's that working out? Practicing the religion, how's that working out? Are we free to do that? I seem to remember in the last year governments curtailing people going to synagogue. Governments curtailing people going to church and mosque. Governments telling us that we can't go and pray to God in the way we want to go and pray to God. Well, that's not religious freedom, is it? Is it religious freedom when you have to hide your Judaism or your Christianity or your Islam? Is this called freedom? Is this something that we have to that we look at? I'm not so sure. Let's go to the phones. Larry's on the phone. Hi, Larry.
Hey, Howie, how are you doing tonight?
I am absolutely great. How are you?
Well, pretty good. I don't know, when you talked about young people, children not having any worries, I think that may be where the saying "ignorance is bliss" started. You think?
You might be right. You might be right, but you know, when adults look back at their childhood and say, "I wish I was 15 again," or "I wish I was 13 again," "I wish I was 10 again," where I could get on my bike and just ride around and not have to worry about anything. And adults look back at that as the ultimate freedom, but kids look at adulthood as the ultimate freedom. It's really an interesting dichotomy there, isn't it?
Yeah, it is. I think that maybe adults, when they try to contemplate the future maybe and think how things are going to be, at least looking backwards, you've got something concrete to, to conjecture on. You have your past experiences, and maybe people feel more comfortable with that. It kind of brings to my mind Henry David Thoreau in Walden's Pond, when he left society to get out and just go back to nature. And I don't know how he lived exactly, but when he camped out by that pond,
that didn't really work out for him, did it?
Period of time.
Larry, that didn't really work out for him at the end, did it?
Well, no, it didn't. That's what I was going to say. I don't know if he came to any conclusions, but he did make the comment, most men lead lives of quiet desperation. And can't argue with him on that. At least I can't.
Larry, if I asked you to define freedom, how would you define freedom in today's world? How would you define freedom?
I don't know, but however I would define it, I have a sneaking hunch we're losing it, inch by inch or bit by bit, and I feel like we're losing it faster lately. I could be wrong, even though I can't define it. I feel like it's getting away from us.
But what's getting away from you? If you can't define it, how could you be missing it?
I don't know. It's a hard thing to answer.
Yeah, it's terribly hard.
It certainly is something to think about.
You know, we talk about this a lot: liberty, freedom, the freedom to move, the freedom to do everything. You have people who want to, you have people like Antifa who are saying everything should be free. There should be no regulations. Government should be free. Everybody should be free to do whatever they want. But is that really freedom?
No, that's irresponsibility, and that's somewhere between I don't know, anarchy and, just total chaos.
Okay,
That doesn't work.
so
Left to their own ends.
so
Humans
anarchy
are very dangerous and they're very destructive.
so anarchy is not freedom, and living the way we're living is not freedom. So we're kind of honing in on what freedom is, aren't we?
I suppose it's kind of making do with what you've got responsibly and adjusting to it, and hoping that you don't have any insurmountable odds to come up against. So maybe that's freedom. I don't know.
Let me ask you this question just before we go, because I have about a minute left.
Sure.
What would responsibly mean? What do you mean by responsibly?
Well, doing what you want to do or feel like you need to do or should do without making anyone else suffer, or keeping it down to a very minimum. And I don't know if you should make other people suffer at all. Now you made me think about it. So I don't know. Just responsible behavior, maybe, and a little luck along with it. Avoiding tornadoes and things that are beyond your control, maybe earthquakes. I don't know.
All right, Larry. Thank you so much for calling. I appreciate it. Thank you, Larry.
Okay, sure.
All right.
Thank you.
We got to go to break. So thank you so much. This is Political Hitman on Israel News Talk Radio. Feel free to call in 301-768-4841. In Israel, you could dial 0265-00151. You could, of course, join me in the chat room on IsraelNewsTalkRadio.com. I'm Howie Silberger. This is Political Hitman. I'm Howie Silberger, your political hitman, right here on Israel News Talk Radio. Join me in the chat room on IsraelNewsTalkRadio.com. Or even better than that, call in. Number to call, 301-768-4841. In North America and Israel, it's 0265-00151. Those numbers, of course, are on the top of the page on IsraelNewsTalkRadio.com. We're talking about freedom. We are in the middle of the holiday of Passover. And Passover celebrates the freedom from slavery of the Jewish people. We were taken out of Egypt. We were marched across the desert. And we commemorate this. This is what we commemorate. And there are various holidays that commemorate different aspects of being in the desert and walking towards that freedom. There are many holidays. Well, not many, but there are a couple of holidays that we commemorate different aspects of the march to freedom. But this holiday here in particular celebrates the freedom from bondage. But are we really free? Do we live a life that's free? Just stop and ask yourself for just a minute. Just stop and ask yourself, what does freedom mean? Define freedom. Most adults can't do it. I asked a group of grade 9 students last week. I asked a group of grade 9 students, define freedom. Tell me what freedom means to you. And they weren't able to do it either. And the reason we can't do it is because we've never lived in freedom. We've never really been free. We've been under the illusion that we're free. So if you lived in the United States or you lived in North America, in any of the countries in the United States or Canada, the countries in North America, you had the freedom of religion, which meant that you could go to synagogue and you could practice your religion any way you want. But if you lived in the Middle East, as a Jew, there was only one country you could practice your religion in, and that's the state of Israel. That's the only country that you're able to be actively Jewish, to be openly Jewish. And even then, in the state of Israel, there are certain areas of the state of Israel where you can't really be openly Jewish without risking your life. Or without heavy guards guarding you. It's the concept and the idea of freedom is really an illusion. And it's an illusion because you can't really define it. It's not tangible. And it's not tangible because nobody's ever experienced it. Except for the people who left Egypt and walked to Israel. Now, we're supposed to feel like we are those people, but how could you relate to those people when you're living in bondage? Now, okay, let's put aside the COVID regulations and the bondage that we've lived through the last year, where our governments have forced us to stay home, have forced us to wear masks, forced us to do a lot of different things, some of them sensical, some of them really nonsensical, but we followed them, we did what they did. We did what we did for the sake of health, and we followed the rules, and we lived under the oppressive curfews and the oppressive lockdowns. We lived through all that. We all have a common thread there. We could all relate to that. Everyone in the world could relate to that. So let's put that aside for a second. Let's look at the average person. And how free is the average person? The average adult. Children are a little different. Let's look at the average adult. So, this is the freedom of an average adult. You have to have a place to live. Therefore, you have rent to pay. Now, when I say rent, I rent or mortgage or some kind of payment for your building, for your house. You have taxes to pay. Now, in order to pay your rent and to pay your taxes, you have to make money. You can't do that without making money. So, in order to make money, you need a job. In order to get a job, you need skills. In order to get skills, you need to either work or go to school. It's one or the other. So school, whether it be a trade school or a university, will give you skills to do certain jobs. And those skills will allow you to get the job. When you go to universities or to trade schools, you live under rules. Somebody tells you have to be here at 8 o'clock in the morning. You have to stay here till 5 o'clock in the evening. You have to do this. You have to do that. There are a series of rules. So you must follow those rules. So you have a taskmaster telling you what your tasks are for the day. Whether you go to university or you go to trade school, it's the same thing. When you finish university and trade school, you say, I am free from school. I have done my duty. I've paid my dues. I'm free from this oppression of school where somebody has to stand there and tell me what to do. I thought that when I turned 18 and my parents stopped telling me what to do, then I wouldn't have to worry about that anymore. But then I went into school, and then I realized that it's a whole new parent-child, no matter how old you are, it's a parent-child relationship where the parent, the teacher, or the professor tells you what you have to do, and you have to follow it because you're the child and that's your job. So now you're oppressed. So now that you've finished your schooling, or your training, or your apprenticeship, which is even further, a further taskmaster telling you what to do. Now you're clear. You say, great. I have finished my education. I am old enough to move out of my parents' house. I've finished my education. I can now go and live my life free, and free. Free as a bird. Then there's rent. There's taxes. Then you get married. You have kids. You got to pay for your kids. these bills start piling up. And you have to go to work, and you have to work in order to make money to pay these bills. And then people, being people, and not really following the 10 Commandments. Commandment number 10, don't covet your neighbor's goods, right? Don't be jealous of your neighbors. We don't really work that way. And no matter how religious you are, you're always looking at the guy next door to you and saying, if he could do it, I could do it. And so you enter the rat race, as they call it. And the rat race forces you. It's almost like peer pressure in a school. The rat race forces you to work harder and harder, to work longer hours, to make more money, to be more successful, to walk around with 2, 3 cell phones on you to show how successful you are, to be the most successful person you could be in your community. Because you got to remember, now the communities around the world, and it doesn't matter if they're Jewish communities, Christian communities, Italian communities, it doesn't matter. It doesn't matter where you are and who you are. The communities respect one thing and one thing only. Doesn't matter how much work you do in the community. Doesn't matter how much time you put into it. Doesn't matter how dedicated you are to anything. The only thing communities in general respect is money. How much money do you have? What do they perceive is in your bank account? Now, you could be a good faker and pretend that you have a lot of money and not be rich at all and rise to the echelons, but you really won't rise to the highest echelons because that requires donations. And if you don't give those donations, you don't get anywhere. So suddenly, money becomes the main aspect of your life. Now, of course, you have religion. Religious people have religion, and that's a big chunk of life. But with religion, you have to look at money. You can't have 15 kids and not have money to pay for them. So one goes with the other. And so you got to work really hard to make the money. So you start work at 7 o'clock in the morning. You work until 8 o'clock in the evening, every single day of the week, except for Shabbos, of course. On the weekend, Saturday, Friday night, Saturday, you don't work at all because that's God's law. But you work every other day of the week. And you toil away. Now you're a slave to society. Now you're a slave to your job. Now you're a slave to what society expects from you. So suddenly your freedom has disappeared. You work so hard to get to that point of freedom, and that freedom has dissipated. It's evaporated. It's gone. And now you're a slave to everything you do. And you start slaving away at the work in order to pay your bills and feed your family and put a little bit of money away so that you could have an easier time when you retire. And perhaps buy a building, buy this, buy that. And the more you acquire, the more of a slave you are to your possessions. Walk into the average person's home and look around. And you'll see that they have a collection of all sorts of stuff. I mean, most of it is nothing, is useless. It's materialistic garbage. But it's there. And it's there because when neighbor comes over, or when the other neighbor comes over, and they don't see that 72-inch TV in somebody's living room, well, you just don't rate, do you? When the president of the synagogue comes over and doesn't see that $3,000 sofa, oh my gosh. Really, are you a pauper? How could you live in this neighborhood? So the idea of freedom has to be a little more than just we turn 18 and we're free to do whatever we want. We have the license, the car license, and we have the license to do what we want. It's more than that. Because we're not free. Even when we have the freedom to be free, we're not free. Now, what if you're a person who says, all right, I don't want to live in this rat race. I don't want to have to deal with any of this. Is it possible to live your life and not deal with this stuff? And actually be free, and not be burdened by the ills and the wills and the needs of society. Just be burdened by the needs of yourself and your family. Is that possible? Could you survive in a society and not play up to the whims of society, not play up to the standards and to the ideals of what that society is demanding? I mean, you can't go to a grocery store and just take groceries. They won't give them to you. You have to purchase them. So you need money. You need the job. But do you need all the extras? But then they argue, well, extras cause extras. They make us comfortable. And so who doesn't want to be comfortable? And if I could send my kid to the private Jewish school rather than the public school, won't he get a better education? So why shouldn't I send him to private school? I could afford it. Why shouldn't I do it? And this is where the circular logic comes in, where we celebrate freedom, but we're still living in captivity. I'm Howie Silberger. This is Political Hitman on Israel News Talk Radio. I'm Howie Silberger, your political hitman, right here on Israel News Talk Radio. You could join me in the chat room at israelnewstalkradio.com. You could call in. In North America, the number is 301-768-4841. In Israel, the number is 0265-00151. We're talking about freedom. Do we really live in freedom? Does freedom really exist? Now, I had asked my grade 9 students last week to define freedom. And I said, just give me words, because critical thinking isn't really taught in schools anymore. So when you ask grade 9 students or grade 8 students or grade 7 students to think about something, to reflect on something, to consider something, and to come up with some kind of a lucid response, it is almost impossible to get anything concrete out of them because they're not taught to do that. Sure, sure. In the high school I teach at, I mean, it's a yeshiva high school, so they're taught to be critical about Gemara. They're taught to be critical about Mefarshim but also about all the other learning tools that they do in Judaism. But they're not taught to convert those skills to a secular studies. So when I asked them in a history class, or I asked them in any of my other classes I teach, to define something, or to think about something, or to reflect on something, or to look at something, they have a hard time analyzing things. So when I asked them to analyze freedom, and I said, I'll give you time. Why don't you sit in groups? You could sit there. There's not that many kids in the class. There's 11 kids in the class. I said, okay, you break up into your own groups. You could sit, you could be 2 of you or 3 of you, however many you want in a group, and have a discussion about freedom. Tell me, what does freedom mean? I just want a definition. I want you to tell me, as a 14 and 15-year-old kid, what does freedom mean? And they sat and they were talking about it. And of course, like kids do, they're sitting around and the conversation kind of trails off into something else and you have to go and refocus them. And I let them talk for about 25 minutes. And I figured, in my brain, 25 minutes, these kids should be able to come up with some kind of working definition of freedom. And then we can go and explore that freedom in relation to whatever we were learning in history at the time. Does it really work? Does it apply to historical events? Does it apply to our lives today? And this is what we were looking at. It was a general conversation. And the first group, I said to them, "Hey, tell me, what is your concept of history? What is history?" And one of the boys looked at me and said to me, he says, we were talking about it, and history is being able to walk in the street without a policeman asking me for my papers. This was freedom. So I said, all right, we have to take this a little bit out of the COVID context because these kids they have late classes, and they have to go home, and there's a curfew in the area that we live in, and they have to go home after curfew, and they have papers they have to show the police. If the police stop them, they show them the papers, so they don't get a $1,600 fine. So so the kid's concept of freedom was not having to carry this paper with him. Now he didn't make the correlation about carrying paper to Jews that were oppressed in the Soviet Union, to Jews that were oppressed in Germany in the 1940s. He didn't have that context to make that connection, because the way history is taught in high schools today is pretty dismal. So he didn't have the connection to make the context, to make the connection between carrying papers with him now because of COVID and connecting it to the oppression of Jews in the past who had to carry papers because they were Jewish and had to prove their Jewishness, or had to prove who they were, or had to show that they were Jewish, or wearing a star on your chest to indicate that you were Jewish. So he couldn't make that correlation. But his concept of freedom was not having to carry that paper. And I thought about that for a while. And that was the best answer. The rest of the answers were pretty much nothing. They had nothing to say. But that answer I thought was fairly interesting. I thought that was the best and most interesting answer. Because as much as we don't live in freedom, as much as we do live in the bondage of material items, the bondage of society, the bondage of I'll call it peer pressure, to live up to a certain standard, even though we live in that society, in that pressure cooker society, where we have to keep up with the Joneses, where we have to be able to have the latest car and have the latest TV and have the latest everything, because that's what we have to do in order to be accepted into the societies we live in. Even though we live under that pressure and that bondage, are we still living in freedom? Thinking about what this kid said, are we still living in freedom? And we might be. I mean, I don't have to worry about wearing a yellow star on my chest and people looking at me and saying, Jew. I don't have to worry about that. And I don't have to worry about being deported from the land that I was born in because I'm Jewish and they hate Jews. And I don't have to worry about them stealing all my items and me having to run in the middle of the night to catch a transport to get out of there. Otherwise, I'll be killed because of my religion, because of the way I was born and the religion I was born into. So, as much as we're living under bondage, maybe we're still living under freedom. Maybe the fact that there's an army in Israel that's ready to protect Jews around the world. If Jews are in trouble, the army's ready to go out and the country's ready to go out and save Jews all around the world. Maybe that's a sign of freedom. Maybe that's an indication that we are living in a free society. We were living under some semblance of freedom. Even though we have regulations, even though we're stuck in the rat race, even though we have that pressure on our shoulders. Lev just posted up on Facebook. He said, "Howie, don't be shocked here. Here in Israel, they are only making the connection now. A year later, we have lost every human right. No freedom left anywhere. We have allowed it to happen." So he's talking about COVID regulations. And governments like the power, so the COVID regulations get stricter and stricter as we go. Even if you have a vaccine, now you still have to wear a mask. And it's kind of getting ridiculous, but that's the point I was making. The point I was making is, even with these restrictions, there's nobody holding a gun to our heads and saying, "Hey, Jew, we're going to kill you." And that's a freedom in itself, isn't it? So they restricted me from going to synagogue for a year. They closed down my synagogue, and my synagogue has been closed for over a year. But they didn't come and shoot me or arrest me or deport me. Is that freedom? I mean, it's kind of sad if that's the only freedom we have, that we're not being killed. But that's the only freedom that this 14-year-old boy could come up with out of a class full of children. It's the only freedom that he was able to point at. So either we're not teaching critical thinking properly, or we're not appreciating the freedoms that we do have. As humans, we tend to look at the negative all the time. As humans, we tend to always be pessimistic and never optimistic. But perhaps we have to start changing our attitude. Perhaps we have to start turning around and looking at ourselves and saying, "Hey, wait a second. It's not that bad. It's been worse. I mean, our ancestors had it worse. I wouldn't have wanted to live during the Spanish Inquisition. I wouldn't have wanted to live during the Holocaust. Our ancestors have had it much worse than we have it today. And we do live in a society that tolerates us. I wouldn't say accepts us wholesale, but mostly tolerates us. And no matter where Jews are living, we're generally tolerated wherever we are. Now that's a low standard. I know it's a low bar, but it's a bar nonetheless. So should we be happy about that? Is that something that we should be celebrating? Now these are questions that should be addressed. These are questions that we should be talking about at Passover time. And the reason we should be talking about this is because if we are celebrating freedom at Passover time, if we are celebrating freedom, the freedom of the Jews leaving Egypt, and we're told that we have to consider the Jews leaving Egypt as if we are leaving Egypt today, if that is our goal and that is what we are doing, then we have to look at all the different aspects of it. We have to discuss the issues. We have to understand how this applies to today's society. How does it apply to us today? And that's something we generally never do. There's that old joke, they tried to kill us, we escaped, so we eat. Every Jewish holiday. But that's not really the case, is it? And as long as we don't challenge our children with these questions, and challenge ourselves with these questions, and come up with some kind of answer, then are we really celebrating Passover in the right way? We have to be looking at these questions. We have to be examining our lives and understanding that the holiday is to celebrate the escape from Egyptian slavery 5,000 years ago. But it's also how we could change our lives today so that we could escape slavery of modern day. If we have to apply ourselves and say that it was as if we lived there, then we have to look at our society today and understand that it's our job to look at our society today and see how we could get ourselves out of this Passover, how we could get ourselves out of this slavery mentality. I'm Howie Sorger. This is Political Hitman. Thank you for joining me. I'll see you again next week right here on Israel News Talk Radio.